Welcome NSF. We are very pleased to have everybody in attendance this morning. We have our two rock star speakers getting ready to give you a walk through the Biden-Harris National Security Strategy. But before we do that, I'm going to start with a few quick announcements. First, a warm welcome and thank you to our partner and sponsor, MSTS. MSTS Mission Support Technical Services is the contractor that manages the Nevada test site, now the National Nuclear Security Site in Las Vegas. And they are joining forces with us, NSF, to bring you some very interesting programs over the course of the next year. So we're starting that off with a look at the policy side. With Ray and Keith presenting. So thank you very much to our corporate sponsor, MSTS. We welcome all of your participants. They will be bringing about 60 new members to NSF from Las Vegas. And so this is our inaugural program, and you'll see more Las Vegas folks joining us in the next few programs. So with that, Keith and Ray, you are both old hands at NSF. So Keith, if you want to go ahead and bring up the presentation, I'll let you guys take it away.
Thank you, Maureen, and good morning to everybody. We want to say we're glad to be here on site again, if you will. Ray and I have teamed together for the last 46 years, so here we are again this morning. We're still trying to get it straight, but we'll keep working on it. We're going to be dividing up the presentation. I'll take the first part of it, and then Ray will come in with what I consider the more difficult part of it at the end and with the conclusions. We want to also welcome the high school students who are tuned in today. We think it's really great to have individuals from your generation interested in learning about these things. We will do our best to explain what we can. We have sometimes more questions than we have answers, so bear with us. We hope that you will offer some questions, as Maureen has already suggested. And we also want to offer in the future, if it works with your classroom schedules, I think Ray and I individually or together would be willing to come on Zoom and answer any individual questions and have a further discussion with you on things that are of particular concern to you. So do not be bashful. This is a good chance for you to kind of get your feet wet with some of this, and we'd be happy to be as helpful to you as we can. With that, why don't we begin? The first question everybody should ask, okay, based on what are you speaking today? Well, there's not a whole lot available yet, but you can see the kinds of things that are out there, and they're tidbits. So the best we can promise you today is kind of a broad brush look at where this administration appears to want to go, some of the early actions that have been taken, and we're confident that over the next 4 years, there'll be plenty of opportunities for NSF sessions on the Biden administration's national security posture. For today, this is what we plan to cover. As you can imagine, when Maureen asked us to do this, we said, well, you know, it takes several months for an administration to kind of get its act together, but we'll do what we can. And she said, well, kind of cover the waterfront. Well, there's a big waterfront, so all we can do is kind of touch on some of this, but to hopefully stimulate your interest and also prepare you for paying attention to what you'll read in the news and what may happen in the coming months. Here are the key players. As you look through that list, you'll see many former Obama officials. You'll see governors, diplomats, military officers. There's one potential new addition, that would be the new Attorney General. Judge Merrick Garland is currently going through his testimony, so we'll see whether he joins the crowd of individuals who will be the backbone of the Biden administration national security team. The council itself is going to probably be pretty traditional. As you see, many principals and staffers as I said, under Obama. It's probably a pretty cohesive group. We'll see how it works out. But remember, there will be institutional rivalries. There always are. And the policy process promises to engage more domestic issues overlapping foreign issues because of where we are in our history. And time will tell us who on the council has the most influence. This new domestic policy council is being set up. We don't know much about it yet, who's going to be on it. But again, as part of that integrating domestic and foreign national security issues. Here are the priorities that we can discern at this point of the Biden administration. Keep in mind that whatever priorities a given administration sets out at the beginning will be greatly influenced by two primary factors. What happens internationally that forces the US to react, and also domestic political considerations, which always enter the foray. So let's start with NATO and other allies. Clearly, rebuilding relations with NATO is a prime goal of this administration. But what about US leadership? Is it weakened? Will we have the same kind of influence we've had in the past? Good question. What about the growing Chinese power and North Korean nuclear capabilities? What does that mean for our relationship with our allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan principally? Good old Russia, always there, always a challenge for us. Now, the administration took an early initiative to agree with Russia to extend the New START treaty for 5 years. Good step, but what happens next? What will follow this? What can Biden actually do, given the political constraints of working with Russia, as well as Russia's own interests? Moreover, Russia does continue to challenge us in a number of areas of the world, even though it has serious economic and political weaknesses. And Russia is striving in certain areas to introduce new technologies, which you see in the news from time to time, and which people sometimes get quite concerned about. China. We have an interdependency which requires careful management. And all of the administration key players, Blinken, Austin, and most recently, nominee for director of CIA, Bill Burns, have flagged China as kind of the pacing challenge for the administration. There are tensions in the South China Sea, issues of freedom of navigation, trade routes, etc. And what about the future of Taiwan? We have relations with Taiwan, and will it end up being like Hong Kong? Will the Chinese finally decide they can push the US and the rest of the international community enough to say, we want it and we want it now, and you'll have to just accept it? Keep your eye on that one. North Korea nuclear disarmament. Kim's not going to give up his nuclear arsenal, so perhaps we won't give up sanctions either. So there we are, kind of at loggerheads with him. Will Biden risk personal diplomacy as Trump did? There are risks when one does that, because the unrealistic expectations arise when people think, peace is just around the corner. And of course, our dealings with North Korea affect, again, our other allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and our dealings with China. So the question is, how is Kim going to test Biden's resolve and test his backbone? Now we come to Iran. Biden has claimed he's going to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Well, we'll see what happens. It's not as easy done as it is to claim as a goal. There's a lot of political friction and resistance already in Congress. And there are certain problematic activities of Iran which require concessions on their part if we're going to get back into this. So watch this one carefully. It's not a given how it's going to turn out. What about Iran's nuclear weapon desires? Is it clandestinely pursuing a program? We know it's doing things which can contribute to that program. Well, best guess US estimates are, if they chose to go full force on it, they could probably have a nuclear weapon in a year. Israel claims maybe 2 years. In either case, if there's no movement towards getting a better handle on this Iranian nuclear thing, is this going to drive Israel to conduct a preemptive strike? Something it has threatened to do in the past. Keep your eye on this one. Nuclear arms control initiatives in general. We already said, okay, the New START agreement has been extended for 5 years. This at least gives Russia and the US an opportunity to think about and perhaps even work out some follow-on negotiations, perhaps to replace the now defunct INF Treaty of medium-range missiles. But there are other technologies that need to be reined in. What about China's participation? This is something that came up numerous times in the Trump administration, and China's response has been traditionally, when you big boys, i.e. Russia and US, get your arsenals down to our level, then maybe we'll chat. Meanwhile, don't bug us. We're going to protect ourselves the best we can. So there's no given a surety that China will ever participate, at least not in the near future. Now, what about ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty? Some of you may remember the saga of this 20 years ago, when the Clinton administration led the international community to negotiate this particular treaty. Then India refused to join, and Pakistan refused to join. And after a while, North Korea said, we're not going to be part of it either. So what good is such a treaty if those countries are not part of it? And then the George W. Bush administration said, well, we don't think it's such a good deal anyway, so we're not going to ratify it. Well, Joe Biden was the minority leader in the Senate at the time in 1999 and pushed hard for ratification and got a bloody nose in doing so because the Republicans, Trent Lott and Jesse Helms, led him into a trap which led to the lack of Senate advice and consent for the treaty. The Obama administration never tried to go after it again because of the political risks and costs involved. The question is, how will Biden calculate the risks of seeking ratification for a treaty which has this kind of history? So I would encourage you to stay tuned on this one. We'll see what happens. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ray Huffstutler, who will take you through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Keith. For this part of the presentation, we've tried to look at some of the issues that have been raised by the president and his various appointees, and to hold these up against changes that have been coming along in the world situation and our domestic situation, many of which make it more difficult to deal with the issues that have been raised. One is the president's hope of restoring American engagement internationally and earning back our leadership position. In the past, much of that position has depended on US military and economic strength and the willingness to use it to intervene in foreign conflicts. But there has been a major shift in public opinion against being the world's policeman. Although most senior policymakers see the U.S. as indispensable to maintaining world peace, less than 10% of the public now agrees with them. There is public support for military action to defend treaties, but most of the public now opposes military intervention to resolve foreign conflicts. We have embraced an America First worldview. Secondly, I would suggest that a divided superpower that cannot decide cannot lead. And that, unfortunately, is where our political discourse stands today. The administration faces an, let's see, we have 15 now. Yeah, okay. The administration faces an immediate decision on the drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. There are currently about 2,500 U.S. troops remaining, as well as some 8,000 allied troops. A new report to Congress by the Afghanistan Study Group, a leading member of which was General Dunford, the recently retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recommends that the May 1 exit deadline be abandoned and that further troop reductions be dependent on improvements in the security situation. Experts told the study group that 4,500 troops is the right level to leave behind. The president has said that he's looking at his options before deciding the next step. The Taliban, however, has continued a civil war that has all but captured Kandahar, the most significant city in the south, as well as administrative cities around the country, centers around the country. Some 70% of the provinces are under attack. Government control, meanwhile, is crumbling before our eyes. Negotiations have produced neither a ceasefire nor reduced the levels of violence. The policy choices are narrowing by the week and may soon consist of two bad alternatives: withdrawal or a significant military surge to stabilize the security situation. The Middle East is the most important area to U.S. security, according to 60% of the public. There is broad support for maintaining a military presence in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kuwait, where we have bases. General Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is to lead a global posture review to determine the appropriate military footprint overseas. A critical consideration is that our military logistics and operations support for our footprint in Iraq and opposite Syria and Iran runs through southern Turkey, through Adana and Incirlik. Over the past few years, there has been an increased alienation of Turkey, which holds the southern flank of NATO and has its fourth strongest army. President Erdogan has dismantled the Turkish secular state and is moving towards an Islamic state. Since the 2016 coup attempt, he has purged the military, the civil service, academia, and the media. Some 50,000 perceived opponents have been arrested. In 2017, he revised the constitution to give himself augmented powers and longevity. Turkey is at loggerheads with NATO over multiple foreign interventions, including backing Azerbaijan over Armenia in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. When Turkey bought the S-400 air defense system from Russia over the objections of NATO, the US imposed sanctions and canceled deliveries of 30 stealth F-35 fighters. Erdogan has also had confrontations with individual EU members and has been criticized over his authoritarian conduct, human rights violations, and military actions against the Kurds in Syria. Turkish negotiations to become an EU member stalled after the 2016 coup attempt. Turkey houses some 400,000 Syrian refugees, for which the EU has paid 6 billion euros to keep them from flooding Europe. Erdogan has threatened to open the gates. The alienation of Turkey portends difficult negotiations to maintain a viable US position in the Eastern Mediterranean. The drawdown of US forces in the Middle East, and the refusal to put troops into Libya and Syria have changed the strategic calculus for the Sunni Arab states of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. They now question if the US will intervene in the event of a serious Sunni-Shia confrontation with Iran and its allies in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. Recently, the United Arab Republic, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco have recognized Israel, which considers Iran its most potent enemy. Saudi Arabia is having internal discussions about following suit, and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Saudi Arabia has also repaired its relations with Qatar, which it had criticized over continuing dealings with Iran. Recognizing Israel over the objections of the Palestinians has paved the way for a new Sunni-Israeli coalition to face an Iranian threat. Because the Gulf Sunnis have preferred to operate indirectly through allies and proxies, this coalition is less likely to become a military alliance than a political economic alliance that pursues confrontational or destabilizing policies in the Middle East that are beyond the reach of US policymakers. And that's because the major source of US leverage over actors in the Middle East is through the control of arms sales and their uses. The new administration has so far been silent on its strategic intentions for the war on terror. This focus on the past decades of uprooting extremist Islamic jihadists has not only reshaped the armed forces from heavy firepower formations to small mobile fighting units, but has shifted our operational attention from Europe to Asia and Africa. Counterinsurgency training and operations continue to be the basis for many foreign military relationships. President Biden told President Putin that the days of interfering with our elections and conducting cyber war are over. Repeated attempts by foreign countries to sway our public opinion have gotten a strong reaction against false news and the manipulation of our social media. I want to suggest that in America, President Biden simply cannot make good on this threat because we have a First Amendment that guarantees that the government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Even hate speech is protected by the Supreme Court. In 2011, for example, the government was forbidden to stop the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas from picketing military funerals with signs like "Thank God for Dead Soldiers," because they objected to a perceived tolerance of homosexuality in the military. Chief Justice Roberts wrote, and I quote, "Speech can inflict great pain. Of the facts before us, we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate," end of quote. As a practical matter, we cannot distinguish between disinformation, that is, falsehoods aimed at achieving a political goal, and misinformation, falsehoods or errors that may be unintended. So who will censor the internet? The government cannot. So Congress has pressured private enterprises, our social media companies, to curb disinformation, hate speech, and conspiracy theories on their platforms. Companies have attempted to use restrictive algorithms to comply, but it is tricky. One example recently in the news was an ad blocked because a model sitting in a wheelchair was showing easy-to-use Velcro closures on handicapped underwear. The ad was designated adult content and restored only after a trip to court. Another obstacle for the social media companies is that their business models seek to maximize user time subjected to targeted ads. hate speech and conspiracy theories have been shown to boost platform addiction. Our current interpretation of the First Amendment has allowed mass distortions of the truth to spread uncontrollably. Many see this as a serious threat. EU democracies, however, manage more restrictive laws on speech and make illegal on the internet what is illegal in the analog society. Perhaps our way of thinking about free speech needs updating. The structure of the internet is largely unprotected and vulnerable. Existing protections consist of ad hoc private firewalls. Because the technology of the packet switching system is inherently insecure, the problem of hacking is persistent for the using public. High cost, controlled access, circuit switching networks are used by the government for classified communications and could be replicated to secure elections. But this would probably entail building a dedicated network and replacing state-controlled systems. The Department of Homeland Security recently released a National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin warning of a heightened threat from domestic violent extremists, some of whom are in contact with foreign terrorist groups which train their members. Attorney General Garland, during his confirmation testimony, echoed this concern with domestic extremists. The bulletin notes that these extremist groups typically hold long-standing racial and ethnic antagonisms and that they target peaceful protests. This is a rising nexus between national security and domestic policy. Because these groups threaten to turn large peaceful protests into violent events, there will be growing pressure for an extensive police presence. When available police forces are insufficient, it will be a challenge to keep the military out of domestic policing. In his State Department speech of February 4th, the president mentioned several human rights objectives: reversing the military coup in Myanmar, mitigating the threat of starvation in Yemen, and addressing the plight of 80 million refugees around the world. He would use diplomacy to repair our moral leadership. The loss of military leverage abroad, a growing American first focus at home, and our own domestic political, economic, and racial turmoil make this a heavy lift for diplomats. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accord will entail familiar industrial emission debates, most of which have continued for decades without interruption. Less discussed are the national security and domestic issues of refugees and immigration caused by climate change. Tens of thousands of refugees wait on the Mexican border to enter the US. Estimates range from 25 to 65,000. Most are fleeing poverty and starvation, caused in large part by climate changes in weather and water in Central American farming areas and the attendant crop failures. Hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced. This is a growing and enduring problem. The president hopes to admit 125,000 refugees a year by expanding processing facilities and hiring administrative judges. But immigration policy is one of our most intractable national debates. Controlling a huge and growing flood of refugees will continue to pit the administration's human rights objectives against practical realities. As the world's strongest economy, the US has had the resources to be a world leader, but times are changing. The coronavirus has crippled the economy and choked tax revenues. We have amassed huge debts from relief programs to survive the pandemic. At the same time, military disengagement, coincident with expanded entitlements, foreshadows pressure on the defense budget. The fiscal year 2019 federal budget, the last for which there are settled numbers, was $4.4 trillion. 70% of this budget was for mandatory expenditures on entitlements and debt service, mostly Social Security and Medicare. 30% was for discretionary spending, of which defense and veterans affairs are more than half. All other federal programs came from the remaining 13% of the budget. Resources to reorient the military to deal with China, to modernize our nuclear forces, to impose trade sanctions or climate policies that affect US jobs, to relieve refugee problems, to support allies like NATO, or to subsidize the rebuilding of Afghanistan will be hard to acquire. The Biden national security team is entering a changed world where our influence is greatly diminished as a result of the growing strength of China, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, our military withdrawals, the loss of faith in US commitments, the use of economic sanctions against both allies and competitors, our shift in public attitudes towards solving domestic problems first, and a weakened economy. Restoring American international leadership to the prominence of decades past is going to be impossible. The so-called Pax Americana is over. Here are some of the major conclusions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to take questions. So for those of you who haven't, please go ahead and put your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with Keith, and then I'm going to go back and forth depending on where the questions are. Keith, I'm going to go to you specifically on the Iran nuclear deal, and perhaps I'm going to get you to step back before we jump right into the Iran deal, and really, in your mind, sort of what keeps you up at night in terms of the nuclear proliferation issues. You highlighted the usual players, but I'm asking, is there anything else out there, or which one of those do you find to be the most vexing right now? And then specifically on the Iran deal, does President Biden need to get Senate approval or Senate concurrence on re-entering this deal? And if that is unlikely, what are his options? So two-part question.
Let's start with the second one first. When President Obama participated in the negotiation of the JCPOA with Iran, he knew he could not get Senate advice and consent. So he signed it as an executive agreement with foreign countries, not as a treaty that the US was obliged to commit to. Therefore, I suspect that if President Biden felt he had the political strength to go back to that agreement, despite the objections of Congress, he could find himself in a major battle between the White House and congressional control over national security policy. There have already been indications that he's received from Congress, mainly Republicans, but some Democrats also. Be careful on this one, because Iran is continuing to do some things which we don't like. And one of the Achilles heel of the original agreement was it didn't stop some of those things which are problematic for us, i.e. supporting terrorism and doing other things which we feel impinge upon our national security, that the JCPOA was too narrow, too restrictive to really be a meaningful constraint on Iran's nuclear program. So what my concern is, Maureen, is that we, as we have done with North Korea, as we have done with all those others, India, Pakistan, in more recent years, we will have to get used to living with a nuclear-armed Iran. I think it's almost inevitable. Nothing ever is inevitable because all kinds of things could happen. There could be regime change, could be a lot of things. But keep in mind that even the Shah of Iran supported a nuclear weapons program. This is not new to the radical Islamicists in charge of Iran. There is a certain psychological orientation in Iran of wanting to recapture its greatness of the former Persian Empire. And therefore, it has learned from other countries, as India and Pakistan, North Korea have learned, when you have nuclear weapons, the rest of the world has to take notice and has to deal with you. And therefore, my fear is if the radicals are in control of those weapons, as we fear could happen also in Pakistan, for example, then what might happen in the Middle East and other areas where nuclear blackmail could be used to the detriment of our interests.
Great, thank you. That was a very thorough answer. I really appreciate that. Next question, I'm going to bounce to Ray. You described a situation in which we see a substantial blurring of national and homeland security, not blurring, overlapping of national and homeland security, which honestly from the beginning was probably not really separable. But does that, in your mind, change or blur the role of the military, in particular, potentially the engagement of the military in domestic affairs, as we've seen in the last few months and we saw on January 6th?
Well, you would think that for the most part, no. For the most part, no. But the whole threat of violent domestic actors that has really developed over the past 5 years or so has got everybody worried. And that is overlapping in the sense that some of these have foreign contacts. It's predominantly a domestic problem, but it's creeping into the national security arena, and will take some coordination to make sure that there aren't coordinated strikes coordinated by overseas entities or participated in by overseas entities, or overseas entities using our own domestic violent people as proxies. And with the threats of demonstrating in front of Capitol buildings, carrying firearms and that sort of thing, it's going to be a very, very testy time for police. You know, as a policeman standing there looking at an armed and avowedly violent protester, you're supposed to wait until he shoots you in order to make sure that his civil rights are not impinged upon. But that becomes very problematic if you happen to be the policeman. What that calls for then is very heavy policing, very heavy police forces in the area if you're going to have violent protesters carrying guns. And if there aren't enough of them, I think that's when you get the military drawn into the situation as a backup. It's going to be wise heads for many decades have tried to keep the military, the active military, out of domestic policemen. These folks are not trained to be police. They're combat troops. And when you have to mix that up, it becomes a very unstable situation for domestic stability. But in the foreign sense, I don't see that there's going to be much involvement of the military unless it happens to be some sort of counter-terrorist strike against a foreign center. Okay,
that's somewhat reassuring. Thank you. I'm gonna bounce a set of questions to you on the situation in Afghanistan, because it's pressing and timely, and that troop withdrawal is projected, or at least was originally scheduled for May. So between the two of you, can you look into your crystal ball and give us an idea about, is the Taliban likely to, if we pull out, let's just say we pull the plug in May, is the Taliban likely to take control of the government in Kabul? And if so, is it going to be like the Taliban was back in the 90s, or is it going to be a different, kinder, gentler Taliban? And then on the flip side, from the domestic spending or investment and budget, remaining with a presence of a few thousand troops is a marginal cost, certainly compared to what we invested in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. What are the downsides and the upsides of us staying there? So I'll let you both take parts of that as you see fit. You can nudge each other appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, that was good.
I'll start. The security situation is a fact in Afghanistan that will virtually drive, I think, the decision to withdraw troops. I can't really see the Biden administration pushing for a large military surge to try to reverse the gains that the Taliban have already made since the peace negotiations have started. They're conducting a civil war, and basically we're not in it. The central government, I don't think, can hold out without substantially more U.S. support than we can give them with 2,500 troops. And 2,500 troops, I think, are going to end up in a fortified area, hunkered down, unable to do very much. Well, this is very pessimistic, but if that's what you think, then basically you withdraw the troops. And the central government collapses and the Taliban, in fact, takes over the country. Now, they may be somewhat gentler and kinder because the demands of holding the big cities and restoring order and so forth, they will face too once they become or try to become the government. And you will have large, very well funded, very well equipped anti-Taliban militias that have in effect taken equipment and training from the central government and gone back to their warlords, and they will form quite a threat to the Taliban in some areas for some time. But I don't see the US able to stay there for very long. And if you leave a small contingent there, it will not be able to do much more than defend the embassy and the American facilities there. So I'm rather pessimistic about it.
Yeah, I share that pessimism. And for our high school listeners who didn't live through Vietnam, unfortunately, this brings back very distasteful memories of where we spent blood and treasure to ward off, in that case, the communist element of North Vietnam against the South. Finally, the American public said enough is enough. We pull out, and guess what happens? We lose everything that we fought for what, how many years? 15 years or more? And it seems to me we face the same kind of consequence in Afghanistan. And I fear for particularly the females of Afghanistan who've had a taste of liberty, freedom to get educated, freedom to work, freedom to do all kinds of things that we take for granted as normal in life. But under the Taliban rule, they not only discourage, but they punish for it. And I think the retribution and the blood spilling that will take place if we abandon Afghanistan to the Taliban will be unconscionable. But on the other hand, I don't see how the US will support an indefinite policing of that country when we can't really solve the problem. All we can do is have a Band-Aid, which is only temporary.
Yeah, rough situation. And I appreciate you recognizing the role of women, because they did not fare well under the last Taliban regime. We have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to keep moving ahead. Keith, tell us, pull the thread, will you, on the situation in Yemen and how that plays directly into Middle East politics, and where do we anticipate that situation going in the at least near term?
The honest answer is I haven't got the foggiest.
Okay, that's
what
good.
we know is Iran is involved in the Yemen conflict. As a result, Saudi Arabia is fighting a proxy war against Iran in Yemen. Yemen has been quite unstable for a long time, sort of like Somalia. That part of that area of the Indian Ocean, the Gulf area, just seems to be perpetually unstable. And I don't see how we can have much influence other than encouraging the Saudis against the Iranian extremists. But I don't have a good feel. Maybe Ray, you do, but I don't have a good sense of how that's going to get resolved.
Well, as far as I know, the situation, the Houthis control most of the key areas, and they had established a stranglehold on shipments and the ports and the roads and so forth. The president was able to break that grip when he stopped declaring that whole thing as a terrorist spot and open up to some food relief to the population. He was able to get the Saudis, I think, to stop some of the bombing because we have this leverage over controlling the flow of weapons to most of the actors. And those, when we sell weapons, we put in there restrictions on the use of those weapons. And that's one of our only sources of direct leverage that we have over actors there. So I think the president was able to calm things down enough to allow food to pass in. But this is a proxy war between Shia and Sunnis. And in Yemen, the Shias have the upper hand, so that there will probably be violence and some sort of low-level violence, maybe not bombing raids, but low level of violence is going to keep that country poor and needy for a long time to come.
Yeah, challenging situation and heartbreaking human rights issues there. A couple issues you haven't touched on. So insightful question about, and Keith, perhaps this is to you, do you anticipate the Biden administration will support the European attempts to go after Turkey and Azerbaijan for the issues in Nagorno-Karabakh? Is that something the US is going to engage in, or are they just going to stay on the sidelines and stay quiet?
It's hard to see how we can stay in the sidelines very long with NATO's cohesiveness at risk. Turkey has served as a key to NATO's eastern flank and base for US military operations into the various things we have done in the past. That need may weaken over time if we get other options. But nevertheless, you have the risk to the cohesion of NATO. And you also have, remember, the historical Greek-Turkey conflict, which has kept Turkey at bay out of the EU for a number of years. So you've got European and US interests at stake here. And I don't really see how we can square this circle, because if Erdogan and his colleagues continue to push towards the kind of governance they want, it's going to make it even harder for the US and for the rest of NATO to accept Turkey with confidence that it can be taken into military planning without risk. And now you get Russia involved, of course, with selling weapons to Turkey, much to our objection. And you can't forget the Kurdish problem, because the eastern third or so of Turkey is Kurdish. And for human rights perspectives, we want the Kurds to be able to have their day in court, right? But the Turks don't want to let that happen. So there are enough issues there involved with Turkey that make, I think, the future of it more problematic than optimistic.
Okay. Okay, so that wasn't an easy answer. Now I'm going to turn to Ray and ask him a similar challenging question. How do you see the Biden administration dealing with the situation of China and the Uyghurs? Pulling the thread on that being yet another human rights issue that we have to balance in terms of a whole lot of other issues in that relationship.
Any progress on human rights has been extremely difficult. It's been a part of our diplomacy for decades. And we have, I think, cheered up people who are standing on the sidelines, but I'm not sure that we've actually changed the situation on the ground for a lot of people that have been affected. I mean, you look at the Rohingyas, you look at Syrian refugees, you look at some of the African wars. It's been very difficult to show any discernible progress on the ground in those spots as a result of our human rights efforts. Moreover, we have lost some of our leverage. We have been able to offer help and aid for some situations in the past, but right now the American public is not attuned to solving other people's problems. And our budget coming up, as I tried to suggest, is going to be very tight to try to get something out over and above the needs that have been created by this pandemic to give away to other people for human rights issues. So I'm expecting that human rights will become part of our diplomatic offensive. I don't expect to see many changes in the Chinese attitude toward the Uyghurs or their treatment of the Uyghurs as a result of our human rights interests.
If I can just chime in on that with a little bit of history, again, for our high school students, when Jimmy Carter came into the presidency in the late 70s, human rights was big on the agenda. And he turned his back on some of the traditional policies of national security in favor of the human rights taking priority. And he learned, to his chagrin, that realities forced him to change his tune dramatically. In fact, for a guy who came in saying, I don't want and I hate the use of covert action to influence the events of other countries, he ended up launching the largest military covert action the US has ever launched in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So we have to keep in mind that our heart may be in the right place, but the realities of what we have to do can be forced upon us, and we have to react to it in pragmatic ways, which sometimes are in conflict with our idealistic ways.
Right. Reality always comes back to bite you. So Keith, pulling the thread back on the nuclear issues, we've seen overt and covert, as you mentioned, development of nuclear capabilities, both by China and Russia. And let's just focus on them for right now. In addition to the policy issues and the diplomatic issues and the treaty issues, what do you see the Biden administration doing in terms of strengthening or revamping or improving the US domestic nuclear arsenal in responding to those threats?
Before the pandemic and the printing of billions of trillions of dollars to try to thwart the consequences of it, I thought for sure that the modernization of our nuclear arsenal was a sure thing. I'm not so sure now that it's that guaranteed. It is a requirement. If we're going to maintain a nuclear deterrent, it has to be credible. And there are times when that means you have to invest in things you otherwise would not like to spend money on. But if it's going to be a credible deterrent, it has to be safe, safe to have, it has to be reliable to use, and it has to be perceived by potential enemies as a credible deterrent, not as just a fig leaf. So therefore, my sense is that this administration will eventually have to bite the bullet and allocate the funds, probably within the defense budget, taking from Peter to pay Paul, but we're going to have to do some upgrades and some modernization of that nuclear arsenal in order to maintain its credibility.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation, and we haven't done a lot of really hard investments in the improving of our nuclear stockpile.
All administrations have continued to kick the can down the road.
Yes.
Look at somebody else's problem, but somebody's going to have to pay the bill.
So, Ray, I'm going to turn back to you, pulling the thread on what you mentioned in terms of cyber warfare. Not only did we have the election hacking issues, but we obviously had the huge hack of the SolarWinds attack, which President Biden has now confronted Russia on to some degree. How do you anticipate policies evolving to be more, I would say, preemptive in preventing some of these, as opposed to just finger wagging and scolding after they occur and have already had major impacts on our infrastructure?
Well, I think the reason we're seeing finger wagging is because nobody knows what to do. It is in our system. It's very difficult to police content, and so we can ask them not to send the content, but that gets universally ignored. I read in Myanmar that they're policing the internet with wire snippers. They're simply cutting off all access.
The old-fashioned way.
For us. And technically, it's almost impossible to secure the technology that we've got because it's cheap and widespread. Lots of people use it. And if you wanted to really secure it, it would be very, very expensive and not very widespread, and people couldn't use it, so that we have a dilemma, I think, in this country about what to do. The alternative is to strike back and to use offensive techniques to strike back at the Russians or the Chinese or whoever, the Koreans, whoever are conducting these invasions of the internet. The problem is that we have the world's biggest glass house, and it is possible. I mean, we can do it, and so can they. You know, we can shut down power networks. We can shut down waterworks. We can make sure that whole communication systems are shut down, but they can shut ours down too, because none of these are protected. Everything that's run by a computer, unless it's got very heavy firewall, and even at that, you saw that the SolarWinds episode breached a large number of firewalls. We don't have any assurance that we won't be very heavily damaged ourselves. So I think that that people are trying to look at some sort of economic sanctions, something that's really not tit for tat on the internet, but some sort of punishing sanctions that would get back and dissuade people from hacking, and more than anything else would try to prompt countries in which hackers dwell to control their activities within that country. But we know from our own experience that we can't control our own hackers who hold municipalities at ransom by tying up their records. So the whole internet is a situation which is simply dangerous if you rely on it too much and don't secure it, and one in which we have very few options, sort of national strategy options of what to do, whether it's technical on the internet itself, or whether it's a policy of sanctions or of some other kind of denial. It's at this point, people are trying to think of what they can do. And it seems to be an intractable problem because this has been going on for 25 years.
Exactly. And it's going to get more complicated. I'm gonna step back to a follow-on question on Afghanistan, which is you gave a lot of good and solid reasons why it's going to be difficult for us to remain there. Are there any advantages for U.S. presence remaining in Afghanistan? And then is there a prospect that the peace process negotiations that were going on in the previous administration are likely to be continued or revectored in any way?
Well, if you're asking me, the short answer is no.
Okay. That was the answer to no advantages to staying.
No advantages for the U.S., for U.S. interests. I mean, the thing that might affect negotiations would be if U.S. aid were a possibility. That is to say, for some rebuilding program, you don't want to totally alienate the U.S. public. And if U.S. aid were some sort of possibility, perhaps you could reduce the level of violence in some areas and come to some sort of agreement. But personally, what do you think the chances are of the American public sending foreign aid to a Taliban-dominated government? I don't see much chance of that.
I have to go back, I guess, because of my history training at the university, but one has to think and study a little bit about the nature of Afghanistan as an entity. And there's a British journalist, Peter Hopkirk, and for the high school students, you might want to write that down. He wrote a very insightful book called The Great Game. And this was back in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries when Britain, Russia, France to some degree, and China all got their nose bloodied in this territory we now call Afghanistan. Controlled by warlords, no strong central government, not a history of that. It's not a country that we could even see should exist as a country in the traditional sense of what we think about national sovereignty and so on. So it's a tough do, and maybe it's not even possible for us to think about an Afghanistan that would be peaceful as we would like to have it be peaceful. Mm-hmm. And I just, as I said earlier, I just feel in my heart for these people who have to live in the middle of this chaos, because I don't see any indication of how it's going to end in a way that doesn't cause a lot of blood to spill.
Well, that's sobering, but thank you for that perspective. I think it's really important. I'm going to close with a twofold question that you can each pull parts to. One is that you focused a lot on the current issues, the short-term issues, maybe short-term, maybe continuing for decades problems, but the problems that we know are out there. You noticeably didn't mention some big elements in the world, like, say, the African continent. So as we look to the next tier of those issues, sort of where do you think Biden and Harris need to focus on as they look out beyond the usual suspects. And then on the flip side of that is, how do we pay the bills for what is rapidly expanding national security posture, issues, challenges globally, along with the domestic issues? Are we looking at major defense cuts? And if we're looking at major defense cuts, how does that rack and stack against a growing set of challenges? So, two things: what's on the horizon, and how do we pay the bills? Nothing is easy in NSF.
I'll put my 2 cents in. What's on the horizon? I think that in the world today, that you have serious problems of poor governance. You don't have to look very far at all to find internal oppression. Most of the world's armies are used against their own people. Pick a country, put a pin in a map, and the chances are very good that you're going to find a country in which there is corruption, rule by elites that have their own militias, a fleecing of the public, and so forth. Very difficult for the United States, in effect, to conduct policies of the sort we want to conduct, which is build trade, and that sort of. We can trade with those areas, but we certainly are not prepared, especially with changes in American public opinion, to go in and try to bring peace to countries that are fighting between either clans, tribes, or secessionist portions of the country. Very difficult situation. It's very unsettled. You have a lot of interest in Africa, and in fact, we just moved, I think, the headquarters of one of our commands so that it straddles Africa, because that's a coming interest of military activity. But as for putting troops in there to try to settle these foreign conflicts and bring peace to people that are fighting, I think those days, quote, as the world's policeman, have passed, and they're not likely to come back anytime soon. So that the short prospect, I think, is that that part of the world is simply going to continue for a while with not much intervention from us. And then you look out in the long term, it is of great interest to us to reestablish some sort of world order like we had with the UN and the World Trade Organization and that sort of thing, to breathe some new life into those, to alter them to handle the problems they were not able to handle before, and to try to get back to some vestige of international cooperation, which allows commerce and people to move around and technology to move around, even though it's going to be very difficult for anybody to do anything about the high levels of civil disorder.
Yes. How am I supposed to top that? My concern is the US can only have as much influence and success overseas as it has strength and solidarity and good health in its economy and social welfare at home. And that's where I think we are sliding into an era where we are our own worst enemy. All those foreign threats are real, and they will take advantage of us to the extent that we are fighting ourselves and struggling just to retain some sense of coherence within our domestic policies and economic policies. It would be easy to say, we just need to contain the North Korean nuclear threat. We're not going to eliminate it, but we need to contain it So maybe that'll require some negotiation and some hard work on our part, but I think it's doable. We need to manage the Chinese relationship, realizing that we have each other at our throats. We can't live with each other very comfortably. We can't live without each other now. So we've got to figure out how to manage that relationship so that it remains benign and not confrontational to the extent where it could risk military conflict. Given Iran and the Middle East, I think this idea of a Sunni coalition is probably a good one. Let the people who live in that district try to contend with each other as best as possible. Even if Iran obtains nuclear weapons, keep in mind, it's on the agenda for Saudi Arabia as well. And they have told us, if Iran ever gets nuclear weapons, so will we. There you go. Now you have nuclear standoff in the Middle East. And don't forget about Israel. I didn't put a lot of attention on them in my earlier reaction to your comment and your question, but Israel feels it's on the hair's edge there. And we've got to try to work with Israel and with the threat it faces to keep Israel from having to lash out militarily because it feels its existence is at stake. And we know they've struck nuclear facilities in Iraq in the 80s. They struck them in Syria not too long ago. If a surgical strike would eliminate the Iranian nuclear weapon program, I'd say go for it. But the problem is it probably will not. It would just end up in a conflagration of fighting between the Sunnis and the Shias, which we want to try to avoid. The African problem is one that I think it basically comes down to human rights and the need for aid. To the extent that we're economically hamstrung, and to the extent that our human rights policies conflict with the realities of what we have to do in other areas of the world, we may be somewhat constrained as to what we can do to facilitate keeping the peace, if you will, in the African continent through aid and those non-military tools that we do have and that Ted Morse and others have spent their careers working on. Yeah, it's a messy world, and the Biden administration, I think, has some ideas about how it can make the world safer for us and for everybody else, but it's going to be a tough uphill slug.
Well,
Could I
Yes.
offer one just brief comment on China? It seems to me that our situation with China is one of confrontation, economic confrontation, and codependence. It is not one of military confrontation. I see more and more that the threat from China is being hyped, and it seems to be a substitute for threats elsewhere. But China, in my opinion, is not yet a military threat to the United States. Even with minor irritations in the South China Sea, I find it unpersuasive that China would try to deny the freedom of navigation when it's the largest export economy in the world. And if they denied anything resembling the freedom of navigation, frankly, the United States could bottle them up in both ends and they couldn't get out of the South China Sea. But we don't have a military confrontation, and we should try to manage that relationship so it doesn't grow into one. They do not have a power projection capability. We do. The only way they can project power is overland on adjacent countries. But we control the power projection in this world. And I think we could very well use it to help control the confrontation. But I worry that too many people are seeing or trying to create China as a military enemy, when at this point it certainly is not.
Interesting. Very good point. And I appreciate your insight. We need to wrap up, and I am very grateful for your time, energy, resources, all your background work that you did, keeping this talk up to speed and up to date. And thank you very much for your insight. You've teed off a whole set of questions that we will undoubtedly be looking at in programs to come during this administration. So thank you all. NSFers, thank you for hanging on. For those of you who did, I apologize to those whose questions did not get answered, but as you know, we always have more questions, and we'll do our best to tee some of those up to the speakers offline. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay warm, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again for our March program on energy security. Take care.